After June 22nd, our delegation, the delegation of the Russian Federation, which was approved by the decision of the president of our country, will be ready to arrive in Istanbul to continue the negotiations. The specific dates, about which many questions are being received, will be determined in the near future, and, of course, will be announced by the representatives and leaders of our delegation. During the next third round, we plan to exchange comments regarding the memorandum submitted by each side on May 28th and June 2nd with proposals for resolving the Ukrainian crisis. As you probably noticed, Russia's conscientious fulfillment of the Istanbul agreements caused in Kyiv a literal fit of rage, if not a fit of madness. Everyone, both functionaries and, unfortunately, journalists from that side, distinguished themselves with extremely cynical comments. One of the presenters of Channel 24 literally without embarrassment claimed, "Can you imagine?" that there were allegedly number 6,000 bodies of Ukrainian soldiers. Allegedly, this is a myth invented by Moscow. But in reality she said the following about Russia. Every time I muster up some inner courage to say this. But I have to do it. Because these are direct quotes. So, in order to increase the number of bodies transferred, according to her, in Russia they allegedly dismembered corpses, the parts of which were then placed in different bags. Moreover, on the territory of our newly reunited regions, according to the Ukrainian journalist, mass exhumations of local residents who had previously died and been buried there before the start of the special military operation were allegedly carried out. Can you imagine how far this painful thought has reached? Such measures were, as she said, planned in nature and pursued the goal of demonstrating to the population the scale of the problem, provoking protest, and achieving the overthrow of the government. But without 6,000 bodies, did she not notice the scale of the problem in Ukraine all these years? It seems that they are showing the scale of the problem to their own population, although they blame the Russian side for this, but now suddenly they have no scale of the problem. The head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, Klemenko, thinks in the same odious logic. He began to accuse our country of deliberately complicating the process of identifying the dead soldiers that we handed over to the Ukrainian side. That is, at first they refused to take the bodies, and then they said that we were complicating something. You know, well, this is some kind of gibberish. This is some kind of devilish muttering that we hear from them endlessly. What has he come to? Let me remind you that this is the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine. Allegedly, we are returning the bodies in an extremely mutilated state, and the body parts are in different bags. Well, can an adult say something like that? Especially since he is a representative and head of a security agency. This is how he talks about people who died as a result of military action. But even that's not the bottom. What I'm about to tell you from his statements, that was a nightmare for me. The head of the Ukrainian Interior Ministry said that the bodies of Ukrainians were mixed with the bodies of Russians. When Ukrainian journalists asked him to clarify how he determined this, he couldn't answer. But I think he should see a doctor. I'm being honest. That's true. But Zelensky surpassed him, although there's nowhere else to go. While in Austria on June 16th, he simply had business there. He said that Russia allegedly offered to exchange Ukrainian children for Russian soldiers. Well, we see from time to time from video footage that he is in a strange state. But to lie like that, I don't know what drugs he is on. This is a blatant, cynical, terrible lie. Probably, again, this lie is aimed at undermining the Istanbul processes, undermining the mediation efforts of those countries that are contributing to this process. On June 12, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius paid an unannounced visit to Kyiv. His task was to synchronize watches on current areas of German and European aid with an emphasis on industrial-military cooperation. Pistorius announced possible additional support for Ukraine in the amount of about €2 billion. In total, this is €48 billion since the beginning of the special military operation. He admitted that these funds could be directed, among other things, to the production of long-range missiles on Ukrainian territory. Well, of course, this is what is needed now to literally finish off Ukraine in every sense. The militaristic atmosphere being whipped up by Berlin is causing growing disapproval in Germany itself. Look, according to polls, 63% of Germans are categorically against deliveries of Taurus missiles. 55% of Germans reject plans for joint production of long-range systems in Ukraine. I would also like to say something about the plans of the European Union and NATO to increase the so-called defense capability of Ukraine. That is, to put it in their own words, and as it really is, how they are digging graves for Ukrainian citizens. On June 12, the heads of the foreign ministries of the Weimar Plus countries met in Rome. It's incredible how many formats they've created. These are Germany, Britain, Spain, Italy, Poland and France, in a campaign with the NATO Secretary General, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. They advocated strengthening the Ukrainian army and expanding cooperation with Kyiv in the military-industrial complex in order to increase defense capability. Do you think this is about Ukraine's defense capability? No. This is about Europe, which is supposedly facing a Russian threat. The Russian president spoke about this myth in great detail while communicating with representatives of foreign media on the sidelines of the forum. Of course, there, in Rome, there were statements about the need to increase pressure, about the need to introduce more sanctions. Well, in general, they need to unite and strengthen their positions, and it doesn't matter that they are not producing results, which the Russian president also spoke about yesterday. But, as they say, they apparently like it. And, of course, the latest data from the Kiel Institute for World Economics from June 16 serves as an indicative touch to these militaristic efforts and the aggressive portrait of modern Western Europe. So, according to its calculations, I will say again that this is not a Russian institution. The total volume of military aid from the European Union to the Kyiv regime reached €72 billion, while the United States provided €65 billion. The record increase in funding occurred in March-April. Now compare these amounts with the loss of profit that the countries of the European Union and NATO have inflicted on themselves, simply by losing the normal opportunity to trade with our country and with other countries. And now they also have indirect sanctions. Can you imagine what these figures are? For decades, they could not find a couple of $1 million to help those in need somewhere on other continents, about whom they cared so much. They never had the strength to solve, for example, issues of clean water in African countries, or issues of medical problems in the countries of the Asian continent. They always talked about it. They always talked about the need to raise funds, that they tried to do something at the UN, these Western countries, but they did not succeed. Look at what gigantic sums they find literally in a matter of seconds, over these few years, for exactly the opposite needs. Not to treat, but to maim. Not to promote healthy birth rates, but to kill. Not to educate, but to make sure that generations could not raise their heads. So many problems were created for them. This is fantastic. And of course, the G7 in Canada did not end the way Zelensky expected. In addition to the fact that there was no meeting with Trump that he expected, They also failed to secure the consent of the allies on the issue of allocating another $1 billion for annual budget support to ensure the stability of Ukraine, as they formulated there. As you know, the final joint statement of the G7 on Ukraine was not adopted. In general, Zelensky left without receiving anything. In general, a good article came out, oddly enough, because different articles come out there. But this time, objectively, in the Politico publication, Ilhan Nuliyev, an employee of the famous German Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, literally the other day, published this article on June 17th. The article emphasizes that the West will not be able to help Ukraine win the conflict, and victory on the battlefield has ceased to be a realistic goal for the Kyiv regime, regardless of how many more billions of dollars the West allocates. But, again, the president of the Russian Federation spoke about this yesterday with facts in hand. No matter how much the West supplies, they still will not be able to achieve these mythical goals of inflicting a strategic defeat on us, of the victory of neo-Nazism in Ukraine, and so on. The author of the article notes, literally a direct quote, that this is not a popular point of view in Washington or Brussels, but even there they increasingly recognize its reality. And, in his opinion, the best way to support Kyiv is to help not to continue the hostilities, but to stop them without losing the future of this country. The current situation of preserving the sovereignty of Ukraine and stabilizing the political situation in Europe depends not so much on weapons as on diplomacy. Frankly speaking, I would like to add that this is simply due to common sense, but I think that everyone understands this anyway. Continuation of the conflict threatens to exhaust Ukraine, destroy Western unity, and strengthen Russia. I want to say again that this is written by an expert of the German Alexander von Humboldt Foundation.